James sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off his glasses. It was late, but work had always been his solace, a way to drown out the growing distance in his marriage. His wife, Clara, had been acting strangely for months. Late-night phone calls she dismissed as work emergencies, unexplained outings with vague excuses, and a guarded phone that never left her side. He had told himself he was being paranoid, but tonight something didn't feel right. His thoughts were interrupted by a notification on his phone. It was a message from Clara. "Working late again, don't wait up for me. Love you." James stared at the words, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Love you. The words felt hollow, almost mocking. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Clara's behavior had been eating away at him for weeks, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. He opened the drawer to his desk and pulled out a small recording device. Last week, he had planted it in her car. He hadn't wanted to. He hated the idea of invading her privacy, but something inside him screamed for answers. With trembling hands, he plugged the device into his computer and played the recording. Static crackled for a moment, then her voice came through, light and carefree, a tone she hadn't used with him in years. "I can't wait to see you tonight," Clara said, followed by a deep male laugh. "You're unbelievable," the man replied. James felt his chest tighten. He leaned closer to the screen, clenching his fists as the conversation continued, each word a dagger to his heart. The call ended with Clara laughing softly, saying, "Same place as always." The room felt suffocating as James sat frozen, the weight of her betrayal crushing him. But instead of breaking down, a cold resolve settled over him. He wasn't going to confront her yet, not until he had everything he needed. The next morning, James acted as if nothing had changed. He kissed Clara goodbye as she left for work, watching her pull out of the driveway. The tracker on her phone pinged moments later, showing her heading toward a hotel on the other side of town. He followed at a distance, his heart pounding but his face calm. From a corner in the hotel parking lot, he watched her step out of her car, her outfit far too glamorous for a work meeting. Moments later, a man joined her, a younger, confident man who greeted her with a hug that lingered too long. James snapped photos from his car, every image a piece of the puzzle he was slowly putting together. When Clara returned home that evening, she smiled at James as though nothing had happened. "How was your day?" she asked casually, setting her bag on the counter. "Busy," he replied, forcing a smile. "Yours?" "Exhausting," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "I'm going to shower." James watched her walk away, his mind already working on his next move. Clara thought she was clever, but she had underestimated him. By the time he was done, she would regret every lie she'd ever told. That night, as Clara slept soundly beside him, James sat in his study, the evidence he had collected spread out on his desk. The photos from the hotel, the recording from her car, and the tracker logs all told the same story. Clara wasn't just betraying him, she was flaunting it, confident that James would never catch on. But her arrogance would be her downfall. James wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He knew that if he confronted her now, she'd find a way to twist the narrative, to make him seem controlling or paranoid. He needed more, something undeniable, something she couldn't talk her way out of. And he needed a plan to make sure her betrayal came back to haunt her, both socially and financially. The next day, while Clara was at work, James made a few calls. The first was to a private investigator. He had already gathered plenty of evidence, but he wanted someone to dig deeper, someone who could uncover details Clara thought she had hidden well. The second call was to his lawyer. James wanted to ensure that when the time came, Clara would leave their marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back. That evening, James set the trap. Over dinner, he mentioned that his company was hosting a charity gala in 2 weeks. "It's black tie," he said casually, cutting into his steak. "You'll need something nice to wear." Clara hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I'd love to go," she said, her tone just a little too sweet. James knew she was already thinking of ways to use the event as an excuse for another meeting with her lover. but that was exactly what he wanted. Over the next 2 weeks, James played the part of the oblivious husband. He complimented Clara's new dress, helped her pick out accessories, and even arranged for a car service to take them to the gala. Clara, for her part, acted as though everything was perfect. She smiled more, laughed at his jokes, and even started cooking dinner, a rare occurrence in their household. James knew it was all an act, but he played along, letting her believe she had him fooled. The night of the gala arrived, and Clara looked stunning in a sleek black gown that hugged her figure. James complimented her, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. They arrived at the venue, a grand ballroom filled with the city's elite. Clara seemed in her element, mingling effortlessly with guests while James kept a watchful eye. At one point, Clara excused herself, saying she needed to make a quick call. James followed at a distance, watching as she stepped out onto the balcony. She pulled out her phone and smiled as she spoke, her voice low and flirtatious. James didn't need to hear the words to know who she was talking to. When she returned, she found James chatting with a group of colleagues. "You're quite the social butterfly tonight," she said with a laugh, slipping her arm through his. "I could say the same about you," he replied, his tone light but pointed. Clara froze for a fraction of a second, but quickly recovered, flashing him a bright smile. James knew it was almost time. He excused himself from the group, making his way to the stage where the night's presentations were being held. The MC handed him the microphone, and the room quieted as James took his place at the podium. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm and steady. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight to support such a worthy cause. But before we continue, I have something personal I'd like to share." The crowd murmured in curiosity, and Clara's smile faltered as she watched him from across the room. James glanced at her briefly, then turned back to the audience. "For years, I've prided myself on being a loyal husband and a dedicated partner," he said, his tone growing colder. "But sometimes loyalty isn't enough. Sometimes the people you trust the most betray you in ways you could never imagine." The room fell silent as James gestured toward the large screen behind him. A slideshow began to play, starting with photos of Clara entering the hotel, followed by screenshots of her text messages with her lover. Gasps filled the room as the evidence unfolded, each image more damning than the last. Clara's face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. "James, please," she stammered, standing up. "We can talk about this." James cut her off with a glare. "You had plenty of chances to talk, Clara. Instead, you lied, over and over again." The final image appeared on the screen, a close-up of Clara embracing her lover on the hotel balcony. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs, the weight of her betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. "I wanted you all to know the truth," James said, addressing the crowd, "because I believe in accountability, and tonight, Clara will face hers." Clara's face was a portrait of panic, her eyes darting around the room as she realized the walls were closing in. The whispers grew louder, and she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her. James stepped down from the podium, his cold gaze locked onto hers as he approached. "James, let me explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." James held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't insult me further, Clara. You've done enough damage." He turned to the crowd, his voice calm but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. My business with Clara is over." The guests watched in stunned silence as James walked out of the ballroom, leaving Clara to face the fallout alone. She turned to the people around her, but no one came to her defense. Her friends avoided her gaze, her colleagues whispered behind their hands, and the weight of her actions began to crush her. When James arrived home, he wasted no time. The private investigator's report had provided him with everything he needed to finalize his plans. He moved the last of his personal belongings into his newly rented apartment, ensuring Clara would return to an empty house. On the dining table, he left a folder containing divorce papers, along with a letter. The next morning, Clara stumbled into the house, disheveled and exhausted. She called out for James, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. When she saw the folder on the table, her hands shook as she opened it. The divorce papers were thorough, leaving her with little to claim. Alongside them was a note. "Clara, you made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. I've already contacted my lawyer, and I've moved everything important out of this house. This is the last time you'll see me. I suggest you sign the papers quickly, because you're not walking away with anything but your lies. And for the record, don't bother reaching out to your lover. I made sure his wife knows everything, too." Her knees buckled as she read the last line. The realization hit her like a freight train. James had not only exposed her, but ensured she had no one to turn to. Her lover's wife would make sure of that. Meanwhile, James was starting fresh. His new apartment was modest but comfortable, a blank slate where he could rebuild his life. He spent his evenings focusing on himself, reading, working out, and planning his next career move. He didn't wallow in self-pity. Instead, he embraced the freedom that came with cutting Clara out of his life. A few weeks later, Clara tried reaching out, leaving tearful voicemails and emails filled with apologies. "I made a mistake," she cried. "I was lonely. Please, James, don't do this to us." But James didn't respond. He forwarded her emails to his lawyer and blocked her number. Clara had made her bed, and now she was lying in it, alone. Months passed and James thrived. He earned a promotion at work, moved into a larger apartment, and even began dating again. The woman he met, Sophie, was kind, grounded, and honest, the opposite of Clara in every way. One evening, as James and Sophie walked through a park, they passed a familiar figure sitting on a bench. Clara. She looked gaunt and tired, her once vibrant energy replaced with a hollow sadness. She glanced up and saw James, her eyes lighting with hope. But he walked past without a word. For James, that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. Clara had destroyed their marriage, but she hadn't destroyed him. He had rebuilt his life, stronger and better than before. As he and Sophie continued down the path, James smiled. He was free, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Clara's life unraveled quickly after James's departure. Her attempts to reach out to friends and family for support were met with cold shoulders and judgmental stares. The photos and messages James had shown at the gala spread like wildfire among their social circle, leaving Clara with nowhere to hide. Even her workplace, which had once been a haven, became a hostile environment. Whispers followed her everywhere, and her boss eventually called her in for a private discussion. "We've been made aware of personal matters that are affecting the reputation of this company," he said carefully. "I think it's best if we part ways." Clara left the office that day with a box of her belongings and tears streaming down her face. Her lover, who had once seemed like her escape, was no longer answering her calls. His wife had confronted him with the evidence James had shared, and he had quickly cut all ties with Clara to save his own marriage. At home, Clara sat alone in the house she had once shared with James. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed. Her attempts to fight the divorce were futile. James's lawyer was ruthless, and the evidence was overwhelmingly in his favor. Clara signed the papers with shaking hands, knowing she was losing everything: her husband, her reputation, and the home they had built together. Meanwhile, James thrived. He channeled his energy into his work, earning respect and admiration from his colleagues. He spent time reconnecting with old friends and even started mentoring younger professionals, finding fulfillment in helping others. His evenings were spent in the gym, pushing himself physically, and his weekends were filled with peaceful hikes or quiet reading sessions. One afternoon, as James returned from a run, his phone buzzed with a message from an old mutual friend. It was a photo of Clara, disheveled and sitting alone in a coffee shop, staring blankly at a cup in front of her. "Just thought you'd want to know," the friend wrote. "She's not doing well." James stared at the photo for a moment before deleting the message. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. Clara's downfall wasn't something he needed to witness. He had already moved on, leaving her betrayal behind. But Clara wasn't done yet. In a desperate bid to salvage what little she had left, she showed up at James's new apartment one evening. He opened the door to find her standing there, her face gaunt and eyes red from crying. "James, please," she whispered. "Just hear me out." James didn't move. He stood in the doorway, his expression cold and unmoving. "You've said enough, Clara. There's nothing left to talk about." "I was stupid," she sobbed. "I ruined everything and I'll never forgive myself. But please just let me explain." James shook his head. You made your choices, and now you're living with them. I don't owe you anything, Clara. Not my time, not my forgiveness, and definitely not another chance. Before she could respond, James closed the door. As the lock clicked into place, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he felt completely free. Clara stood outside James's apartment, staring at the closed door. The rejection stung more than anything she had ever felt. She had lost everything: her husband, her lover, her friends, her job. And now, she was truly alone. She staggered down the hallway, the sound of her heels echoing in the empty space, each step a reminder of how far she had fallen. Inside, James leaned against the door, exhaling deeply. His heart wasn't heavy, it was steady. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was simply the closure he had needed. Clara's apology had come far too late, and even if it hadn't, it wouldn't have mattered. James had no intention of letting her back into his life. Days turned into weeks, and James focused on building something new for himself. He continued to work hard, earning another promotion and solidifying his reputation as a leader in his field. On weekends, he volunteered at a local shelter, finding peace in giving back to others. Slowly but surely, he became a man who no longer carried the weight of his past. One evening, James attended a networking event at an upscale lounge. It was a space filled with professionals, artists, and creatives, all mingling under the soft glow of chandeliers. As James chatted with a colleague, he noticed a woman across the room. She had a kind smile and an easy confidence that caught his attention. Her name was Sophie, and as they talked, James found himself laughing, a real, genuine laugh he hadn't felt in years. Sophie wasn't like Clara. She was grounded, honest, and thoughtful, with no pretense or hidden agendas. Their connection was instant, and over the following months, their relationship grew naturally. Sophie wasn't filling a void. She was adding something new to James's life, something he hadn't realized he was missing. Meanwhile, Clara's life continued to spiral downward. Rumors of her affair and the public humiliation James had orchestrated followed her everywhere. She tried to move to a new city, but her reputation seemed to precede her. Potential employers hesitated after a quick internet search revealed her story. Friends she reached out to offered polite but distant responses, unwilling to associate with someone so publicly disgraced. One day, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from her former lover's wife, detailing how her husband had left her for good after the affair. "You destroyed your own life," the letter read, "and nearly destroyed mine. I hope you understand what you've done." Clara crumpled the letter in her hands, but the words stayed with her. She finally understood the depth of the destruction she had caused, not just to James, but to everyone around her. Regret consumed her, but it was too late to fix anything. She was a ghost of her former self, wandering through a life she no longer recognized. James, on the other hand, flourished. His relationship with Sophie brought him joy and stability, and his bond with his colleagues and community grew stronger. One afternoon, as he walked through a park with Sophie, she asked him a question that made him pause. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked gently. James shook his head. "Not anymore. She's a chapter that's closed." As they strolled past a quiet bench, James spotted Clara sitting alone, her head bowed, her hands clutching an old handbag. She looked up briefly and saw him, her face lighting up with a fleeting hope that quickly faded when she noticed Sophie by his side. James didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply walked past, leaving her behind without a second thought. For Clara, that moment was the final blow, a realization that James had moved on completely while she was still trapped in the wreckage of her choices. For James, it was freedom. He had reclaimed his life, his dignity, and his happiness. The betrayal that had once threatened to break him had become the foundation for his growth. And as he and Sophie continued walking, James smiled, knowing that the best chapters of his life were still ahead. Months had passed, and James felt like a new man. His relationship with Sophie had blossomed into something real and meaningful. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder or questioning his worth. He was thriving, not because of revenge, but because he had reclaimed control over his life. Clara, however, had sunk deeper into despair. Her once vibrant personality had faded, replaced by a shadow of guilt and regret. She had tried reaching out to mutual friends, hoping for some semblance of support, but her calls went unanswered. Even her own family had distanced themselves after learning the full extent of her betrayal. Clara was truly alone, and every passing day reminded her of what she had lost. One evening, James received an unexpected package in the mail. It was from Clara. Inside was a handwritten letter, her words shaky and filled with sorrow. "James, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I had to write this. I need you to know that not a day goes by where I don't regret what I did to you, to us. I destroyed everything we built, and I'll never forgive myself for it. I see now what I had and how I took it for granted. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it all away. I know you've moved on, and I'm glad you've found happiness. You deserve it. I just hope, someday, you can forgive me. Not for my sake, but for your own. I'm sorry for everything." James read the letter twice, his emotions swirling. But instead of anger or pain, he felt nothing but pity. Clara's words, while heartfelt, came too late. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. James folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of how far he had come. That weekend, James and Sophie attended a charity event, one where James had been asked to give a speech about resilience and rebuilding. As he stood on stage, looking out at the audience, he thought about everything he had been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the nights spent questioning his worth. And then, he thought about where he was now, stronger, happier, and free. "Resilience isn't about forgetting the pain," James began, his voice steady. "It's about using it to build something better. It's about taking the lessons life throws at you and turning them into stepping stones, not stumbling blocks. And most importantly, it's about knowing your worth and never settling for anything less than you deserve." The audience erupted in applause, and James stepped down from the stage, feeling a profound sense of peace. Sophie was waiting for him, her smile warm and proud. "You were incredible," she said, taking his hand. "Thank you," James replied, squeezing her hand gently. "It feels good to leave the past behind." As they left the venue, James thought about Clara one last time, not with anger, but with gratitude. Her betrayal had been a turning point, the catalyst for a transformation he never saw coming. And now, as he walked into a brighter future with Sophie by his side, he knew one thing for certain. He would never let anyone dim his light again. For Clara, the lesson had come too late. For James, it had come just in time.